building in this very traumatic period of weather events. And I see, yes, my panelists are there. So I'm going to have come up my panelists, Mr. Hugh Riley, who is the Secretary General of the Caribbean Tourism Organization. We have General Russel Honoré, who spent 37 years in the U.S. military. He also led the U.S. Department of Defense response to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. We have Mr. Tom Hook, North American Director of Planning and Landscape for B&H Architects out of Toronto, Canada. And last but certainly not least, we have Jena Tesse Fox, a writer and editor for Questrex Media's Hotel Management and Hotel Design magazines out of New York. We had some very traumatic hurricane events, and I've been to 4 destinations since those events. The first was in my own country. The hurricanes traveled across the southern part of the Bahamas, and there's one particular island called Ragged Island where we happened to visit, where almost every single building was destroyed, and everybody was forced to evacuate that island. No one presently lives there. They're rebuilding, but it was a very traumatic event to see. The next place I went to was St. Martin, and I was blown away, no pun intended, by the extent of the devastation on that island. And I saw many buildings being demolished because they were just uninhabitable, and persons determined that they could never be reused again. I then went to the Turks and Caicos Island, where I couldn't even tell they'd had a hurricane. The place had been completely reconstructed. By and large, their tourism product was up and running. It was amazing. Next, I went to Puerto Rico, where when I was coming into land, I was amazed to this day how many buildings still had blue tops on their roof. Here is a part of the United States, the richest country on the planet. And still, to this day, there's major infrastructural problems, lights not working, buildings unconstructed, electricity still off in certain areas. So as we face the new reality, hurricanes are getting stronger. They're becoming more devastating. We now have to think about how we're going to live with this new reality, how we're going to build buildings better, stronger, more eco-friendly, more energy efficient. As you know, in the Caribbean, I don't know what you pay, but certainly here in the Bahamas, we're paying in excess of 33 cents a kilowatt. It's very expensive. So we have to take that fact into the design of our buildings. You know, I vacation in Italy, and it's amazing how that country is probably as hot as ours, but yet many of the buildings don't have air conditioning. In the good old days, they used to build the walls thick. They used to have shutters. They'd close them in the afternoons. It would all face inward. They took into consideration the heat of the summer. So with that in mind, we're going to come to our panel to discuss how to address building in the Caribbean, to give us some tips on building smarter, building stronger, more eco-friendly, and taking into consideration the climatic events. So I'm going to start with General Russel Honoré.
It's an honor to be here with you in this beautiful place, and it's pretty cool to see you going to work on Paradise Island. That's pretty. And to make that a reality for people when they arrive here. The reality of the time we live in is that we have, for the last 100 years, tried to take everything and conquer it. We saw the moon, we wanted to go, we went there. We wanted to build faster airplanes. We wanted to make the world flatter so the internet caused us to have a global economy. What we still struggle with is those things that we can't control, like Mother Nature. And the reality is, regardless of what the engineers and architects tell you, on any given day, Mother Nature can destroy anything built by man. And depending where you live, there are certain risks that are higher than others. If you're living out west, it's the fires and the earthquakes. If you're in the Midwest of the United States, where I come from, it's flooding and tornadoes. And when you get to the coast, the primary issue is hurricanes and flooding. And of both of those, flooding, water, destroy more infrastructure and kill more people than any other event globally every year. That being said, when we look at what makes this such a beautiful place that people want to come to, it also exposes the biggest vulnerability, and that is water. People want to be close to it. They want to get in it. And today, the dangers we see from water is not just from hurricanes and from tidal surge, from heavy winds. It's what's in the water. Because we have not protected our water. In the United States, where we created the Clean Water Act, many of you think that the most dangerous thing to water is high tides during a hurricane. I think the dangerous thing in water is going to be the protection of water so we can still get in it. Why? Because what we're doing to it. We allowed, when the Clean Water Act was administered in the United States, it took no appreciation for urine. Now, why would I bring this up at a beautiful conference like this? Because it's literally pissing away our water. Yeah. It's creating the algae issues. And if you think it's not our problem here, just wait, it will be. It's coming. And many people call this climate change. I call it pollution. So we've got two threats from water. One of them is the power of water. And what I have learned to respect after dealing with many hurricanes and floods, there are key words you need to know. If you live on beachfront road, the reality is you're going to flood. It's not when, you're going to flood. So how do we build our properties more resilient? Don't put the generator in the basement. And if you live with 98% sunlight, why the hell are you using fuel anyhow? We need to be in renewable energy, as opposed to going with the same old standard of building, rebuilding, wait until the ship to bring the oil in. That's what they do in England. Okay? Break that British line there. I love the British protocol, but that line of energy needs to be broken. You can create energy on any building here. So I will stop there to tell you we're vulnerable, but it's not just from hurricane and wind, because the biggest damage from hurricane is water, not wind. And we need to build better. There's certain ways we can build roofs and what have you. But in places like this, I will tell you, the key house rule on resilience is if you're in the hotel, the tourist business, the first people you got to take care of is your house staff. Because if you don't have a plan to keep them in-house, I can tell you what happened in Katrina. They left. A week later, hotels were ready to open. They got no staff. I can tell you since then what managers do. They house the staff first, then they take on, and their families. To keep the house staff on and don't know where their families are, hello. If you're going to keep the doors open, you've got to have house staff plan. And how do you retain them inside your structure, which sounds crazy. It sounds counter to everything we've lived with. But if you don't have house staff, you can't open. Because if you can reopen that hotel and you have sustainable energy, it's going to be full. Whatever type of, it won't be tourists, it's going to be recovery tourism. Because people are going to come in to try to help, and that's a key part of resilience. So I'll stop there until we get to specific questions.
Thank you, General. My is a country that is probably 80% below sea level. There's a country full of citizens that figured out how to deal with flooding. So they are canals everywhere, and they have learned not to fight the water, but to work with the water, to absorb the water. The water's going to come, so you need to figure out how to work with it. I think next we'll turn over to Jena. Oh, okay, so we won't go with you next. We'll go with Tom. Tom is a North American Director of Planning and Landscape at B&H Architects out of Toronto, Canada.
So what really is the issue? Obviously, we talked about it. It's climate change. I have a list here. I don't want to talk about them. I just want you to think about what we see with what affects climate change. All of these things are issues that we all know about. We hear about it on the news every day. On the weekend, we just heard about Indonesia. A monsoon that came in, or a tsunami, and it killed 800 people. We were actually looking at an eco-resort in Indonesia. That project is now put on hold just because of what happened on the weekend. So these are the things that affect tourism, that affect our great sort of tourism destinations. So we've got to really remember, how do we really mitigate some of these issues? And again, like the general said, what is the main thing? And really, it's flooding. We've got to stop the flooding. We've got to prevent the flooding from happening. Can we stop it totally? Probably not, but we can really fix it. We can stop it to some extent. So the solution is building better, and through bold and resilient, we talk about resilient, but resilient infrastructure. And what does that mean? That's green infrastructure or low impact development. Now I want to go through this. I'm going to show you some examples of what that means. And as my wife said this morning, don't get too technical. We don't want this to be technical. They want to know what we're talking about. So if I get too technical, let me know. But anyways, we want to talk about infrastructure. We want to talk about green infrastructure, and there's different scales to that. We want to look at it at the master planning scale. That could be regional, that could be district, or it could be island-wide. We're talking about islands in the Caribbean. How can we look at these systems at the master planning scale? There's also the site scale. We talk about a hotel plot like we have here. This is a big one, obviously, but there's a specific plot as well. But they're different. We want to look at the systems at the master planning scale and at that site scale. They are complementary, and they do work together, but there's those two scales. So I'm going to show you an example of what is at the master planning scale. And what we deal with at the master planning scale is site analysis. Every project we do, whether it's a large one or a small one, you have to do site analysis. You want to map the constraints. And I don't like the word constraints because sometimes these are not constraints, but they're areas that we need to consider. They could be natural, they could be ecological, they could be waterways, they could be natural systems. But we really need to look at those natural systems and how we design them. As the general said, we don't want to fight these natural designs, the natural systems. We want to work with them. In the past, we've always tried to bulldoze, get rid of it, just leave it. Let's look at how we can use those systems. At the larger scale, we're looking at the public realm system. Public realm means the open space, the streetscape, the parks. We're not talking about individual parks or plots. We're talking about the public realm. So I want to show you a case study, and this is a project we did called Smart City Kochi. And you're in Kochi, that's in India. Why would we talk about India? Well, let's think about what's happening in India. They get 3 meters of rain in 4 months. That's a lot of rain. And this site doesn't allow for site absorption. So it's a really critical issue of dealing with that water, that stormwater management. So it's a very comparable site. It's a bigger site. It's 100 hectares, complex with topography, waterways, streams, rivers, all of that. But the basic design was to let's look at innovative infrastructure, green infrastructure, resilient infrastructure. And the design was really to preserve, enhance the steep slopes, the natural areas, and the water courses. So just going through, again, that process, again, I don't want to get too technical, but it's the analysis, right? We looked at the slopes. Let's look at what's there, what's existing, and did an analysis of the slope, all of the different percentages of slopes. We looked at the drainage, big part of what we need to do with green infrastructure. Where is the water currently flowing? And we did a whole synopsis, a whole analysis of where that water is running, where the low points are, where the high points are, and how do we use that when we get into the infrastructure? Again, we want to stop the flooding. Why do we fight these natural systems? Let's use them to our advantage. Then we look at the watershed. So how do we look at the water that's coming from the area? What is the amount of water that we need to collect? So we've done these calculations as well. So this is part of that analysis that we do up front that's going to govern our design when we get going. So again, we want to do the green infrastructure. How do we use green infrastructure to prevent the issues of flooding? So when we looked at this, we said we want to preserve those water networks. So if we preserve those water networks, we're going to allow that water to flow. So let's preserve those water networks. Preserve the drainage networks. If you look here, you'll see these arrows that are scattered everywhere. If you look back at that slope diagram, you'll see that they're almost the same. We've enhanced them, we've kept them. You don't really know, but the water can still flow the way it did originally. Allowing it to flow through green corridors will allow us to save the flooding. We looked at the shoreline. The shoreline is big along this canal, along this waterway. We need to do it in different ways. We want to naturalize it in some areas. Areas where we want to develop, we don't want to be low. We want to get the buildings up high, so we terrace it with hard and softscape. The softscape helps absorb the water, but we still want hardscape. In other areas, we have softscape, but we still have access to the waterfront, but it's a natural edge. And then, of course, we do want hardscape, but we limit that to certain areas like a town center, like a marina. But it's really using these different techniques to stop that flooding. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but there are these systems that we use, bioswales. It's basically a vegetated ditch or a swale that allows the water flow through. The difference is the water slows down. The water has time to percolate, and as the general said, we want to filter that water. We can filter it naturally. The water will flow through, and these plants will actually absorb all of those pollutants and all of the stuff we don't want to have in our water. Rain gardens is the same as a bioswale, but it's an area that stays in one spot. The water will flow into it, and it naturally will hold the water and filter it. We want to create detention ponds. We have detention ponds, but a detention pond doesn't have to be something that's over in the corner where you forget it, you fence it, you leave it in. Let's naturalize it. Let's make it as a feature. Let's make it as a feature in the landscape, but it's functioning as a system to store the water. In some instances, we can't do it with the natural system, but we have to collect that water, so we can do it with below-grade storage systems. That water can be stored. We could use it for irrigation. We could use it for other systems later on, but we still are storing that water. A term that we've sort of termed differently is a stormwater park. You're going to go, a park that's a stormwater? Yes, a stormwater park. So this is a park, like any other park where you'd have a playground, you could have a sports field, whatever it is. But in the monsoon season, it fills up. There's areas that will take the water. So you think in the Caribbean, we have an area, we have a hurricane coming in. The water can come in and fill these areas. That's a big area if you start to think of it. It's a large area, but we're making these accommodations for the water. We're accommodating that flood water. Again, we were talking about public realm is streetscape. What can we do with the streets? There's a lot of hardscape. Where does that water go? Well, let's create bioswales in the streetscape. In the medians, instead of having catch basins, we're going to create a bioswale that's going to hold the water, allow it to infiltrate, and allow it to slow down and clear that water for where we want it to go. Permeable paving is something else that we use a lot. Permeable paving is essentially paving that allows the water to run through it. It's not like asphalt that water runs over it. It will allow it to percolate through. Anywhere where we can stop water from running is going to be a benefit to the overall strategy. Another streetscape where we had an open space, we had one of these stormwater parks, we had a catch basin that linked into a biofiltration slope. So here we are, we're using all of these systems going from the street, going down to that stormwater park. Again, all of these systems working together but really in a strategic way of stopping the flooding. We think of green roofs. Green roofs have many, many benefits, but if we think of it in a stormwater way, how can we collect the water, because you're going to use the nutrients to actually allow that green roof to grow? We're going to keep the water on the roof. If you think of a hotel like this, what is the percentage of that roof that's all over that part? It's about 25 to 30%. That's a lot of hard surface. And where's that going? It's running down and then it's going somewhere. If we can store it on the roof and use it as a green roof, we're again limiting that amount of water that's running on the ground. It doesn't necessarily have to be a green roof. We can store the water on the roof. We could collect it in the roof and gradually have it release. It doesn't have to release all at once. We can also release it into cisterns or to those underground storage units. But it, again, is that system of trying to reduce the amount of flooding. So how that water is released with that site as it is a certain amount of water. If we keep that in mind and we develop a hotel, they can't change that runoff. That's a big, big strategy. How do they do that? You know, you have a natural site, it's all vegetated, it's all natural. How do you bring a hotel in and how do you do it? You have to use green infrastructure. You have to use these strategies. So that one thing will restrict, not really restrict, but it will make these developers develop with green infrastructure. Green roofs, we talked about green roofs and how much area a green roof does cover in a property. If we just said, okay, we want 50% of your roofs to be green, you're going to stop 50% of that runoff from those roofs. Bioswales, we talked about them. We can set standards for bioswales. We can set standard details for bioswales so any developer can come in and use those standards. Standard streetscape, we can show a streetscape that has bioswales in it. How do we standardize those in regulations? Conservation areas. We talked about these natural systems. We need to sustain those natural systems and preserve those. Prohibit construction in these non-developable areas. Obviously, we're going to save these areas. We don't want to destroy them as the construction is happening. Don't use it as a storage area or a staging area. We need to preserve those areas. During construction, obviously, we're moving earth around. There's going to be issues of erosion. We've got to implement erosion control systems that stop that from affecting those natural systems. We don't want sediment flowing into the rivers, into the waterways. For staging, we want to, again, establish areas for staging and storage that don't destroy any of that natural habitat. I mentioned permeable paving. If we just set standards for permeable paving, 75% of your paving needs to be permeable. There's a lot of products out there that are permeable. It's an easy system now. We can all use it. Let's implement it as a standard. Planting, we need to look at planting for the bioswales, the different types of plants, native species where we are. How do we reduce the amount of irrigation we need to use? We can standardize that. We can standardize the planting. We can even go down to the actual plots and start to regulate those plots, setbacks, building heights. All of this stuff can be regulated, and municipalities do regulate it. How do we do that in the Caribbean to specify for our resorts? So, final thoughts. Building better for climate change, specifically flooding, must focus on green infrastructure. Government and resort operators need to align themselves with these strategies and create regulations to ensure green infrastructure technologies are implemented. Thank you.
How do you help with the image of the Caribbean when in fact all of the resources that we have are focused in the area, of course, of rebuilding the infrastructure? So heaven forbid that another disaster should occur. The first thing that our member countries are going to be concerned about is getting the infrastructure back up again, rebuilding your schools and your medical facilities and getting the lights back on. They should never have to worry about where do we find the money to get the word out. So it is incumbent upon all of us to have some sort of rainy day fund, to set aside some sort of resource to rebuild the image of the Caribbean, because again, it is our livelihood that we're discussing here. It is not a sideline. Tourism, getting people to get off planes and get off ships and bring foreign exchange into our economies, that's what's going to get us humming again. So one of the things that and by the way, we keep talking about affected parts of the Caribbean, but it is the unaffected parts that also suffer tremendously because people stay away. They think, well, the whole Caribbean must be devastated. So without a good sense of geography, people don't realize that if something happens in Ottawa tomorrow, it really doesn't stop you from going to Toronto, right? If something happens in Toronto, it doesn't stop you from going to Mississauga, and it's all in the same basic geographic area. But people don't get that sense. When Ragged Island was in the southern Bahamas was evacuated, people in Nassau barely even knew that it happened. Why? Because of 100,000 square miles of territory that we're talking about here. But in the Caribbean, people think, well, honey, let's just wait until, things settle down there. Let's go somewhere else. They don't understand. So how do we find a resource, and how do we find the messaging to make it right? We've collaborated, the CHDA and the CTO, in a joint venture which has started a short-term marketing campaign. And in 5 days' time, the region and the world will see a campaign which has been titled "The Rhythm Never Stops," and it's true in a literal and figurative sense. In the Caribbean, we can't let the rhythm stop. But we have to be clear that until we get together with our private sector and our public sector and the interests around the world and get them to understand that we need to find a way to sustainably fund the marketing of the Caribbean, we are always going to have this problem. So even if we were able, and even when we are able to rebuild the structures and get the codes right and get the policies in place, we need to have people coming to us. So I don't want to belabor the point, but the only issue here is that we have to make sure that when we talk about a natural disaster, we remember that a natural disaster is also a messaging disaster. It is an imaging disaster. And people like us and the CHDA and the CTO and the Caribbean Coalition for Tourism have to stay focused on that. I should never forget, though, to say thank you to the media and the people who help us to get that message out. Because in the absence of a proper funding mechanism, we need the Jenas of the world. We need the media. They keep on interviewing us. They keep on joining our webinars. They keep on coming into our midst and helping us to pump the word out. We thank you for that, but when we get an advertising budget, we'll bring some revenue in your direction also. Those are my opening remarks, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. So last but not least, and certainly I'm sure the most powerful presentation, Jena, Tesse Fox. Please go ahead.
Can you all see me over this thing?
Yeah.
How's the sound okay?
Yeah.
All right. Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm Jena Tesse Fox, the design editor for Hotel Management Magazine and the Hotel Design website. Basically, what I do is write about what these people do and what you do. So they have hands-on experience. I just do research and write about it. So I've been really interested in learning about how hotels are rebuilding after these storms. Caribbean hoteliers are really caught in a bind. Guests, as we were saying earlier, want to be right on the beach. But the beachfront properties, as we've said, are going to be the first hit by heavy winds and floods during the storm. This actually leaves a niche that can be filled. At the Chicos conference last year in Bermuda, people were talking about developing mid-scale hotels away from the water. A property that's away from the beach can still attract travelers who maybe don't want to pay $700 a night during the high season. And by building a smaller property farther away from the beach, maybe offering some fewer amenities, you may not only attract people who are looking to spend less when the weather is good, you can also avoid some of the damage during the storm. Second tip, as we've all been saying, improving the infrastructure is vital. On St. Bart's, I was reading the local government buried the pipes for both utilities and water under the ground. This makes them less susceptible to the high winds in the storm. After Hurricane Irma, power and water were both able to be restored to most neighborhoods fairly quickly. Same with water. This is also common in Tornado Alley in the Midwest. It's a really good way to protect a destination's infrastructure. And part 3, building smarter. And whereas Tom did not want to get technical, I'm going to get really technical. So let's start with the structure of the building itself. To minimize corrosion issues, FEMA recommends fiberglass or vinyl frames for buildings located within 3,000 feet of an ocean shoreline. You want stainless steel frame anchors, fasteners, and hardware. If you have to have a wooden frame, use wood that's either specially treated or is naturally insect and rot repellent. This will maintain its strength. You really don't want to find out that your wooden frame is rotting and about to crumble just before the hurricane hits. Shims and bucks should be pressure treated. Since some pressure treatment increases the moisture content of framing, use material that's kiln dried after its treatment to control shrinkage. In areas with termites, you want metal door assemblies. If concrete, masonry, or metal wall construction is used to eliminate termite problems, wood used for blocking or bucks should be treated, or you can opt for naturally insect and rot-resistant species of woods. Again, you really don't want to learn that the wood isn't strong enough when the storm's at its worst. And just for the details, masonry openings in buildings are frequently not exact. They can be called rough openings for that reason. If window products are placed into openings, they often need to be shimmed into place to properly fit. And when a large amount of shimming is required, 1 or 2 pieces of wood can be utilized. Those are the bucks. If the window is only fastened to the buck itself needs to be securely fastened to a host structure, or the subframe. According to the Florida Building Code, where they certainly know about hurricanes, when the wood buck thickness is 1.5 inches or greater, the buck should be securely fastened to a transfer load to the masonry, concrete, or other structural substrate, which then gets anchored into the window frame. In other words, there's a double anchor, not just the buck nailed or screwed into the window frame. So then there are the windows. Beachfront hotels obviously want to offer great views with huge windows, but then a big window can be a target for flying debris during a storm, or strong winds can just rip the window right out of the wall. And then even worse, once the window's broken, all of the other elements can get in and wreak havoc on the building's interiors or even the foundation. Windows and doors can both fail if they're not strong enough to stand up to the wind pressures, or if forces exerted on the doors or windows exceed the strength of their anchorage. When strength is inadequate, the window's glass or frame can fail, or if the anchorage is inadequate, the entire window unit can just be torn out of the mounting. This means that every property should have windows that have been designed to resist wind and windborne debris forces specified in the building code. This can include everything from laminated glass or polycarbonate glazing systems to classic shutters, screens, or structural wood panels. According to FEMA, laminated glazing systems typically consist of assemblies made with 2 or more panes of glass and an interlayer of a polyvinyl butyl or equivalent film laminated into the glazing assembly. During impact testing, the non-porous glass panes in the system can fracture, but the interlayer will remain intact to prevent the water from getting in. Hurricane shutters can also be helpful, but not all shutters are created equal. I spoke with a hotelier with villas across several Caribbean islands who said that after Hurricane Irma, the old traditional heavy wooden hurricane shutters, in his words, really performed well, especially with the larger windows. The pull-down metal hurricane shutters didn't protect the large windows on their own, so he suggested a compromise with reinforced metal hurricane shutters that can be supported from the back with metal bars. For smaller doors and windows, he said the traditional wooden hurricane shutters are still excellent. FEMA says that to be effective, the shutters should fully cover the windows, which can be a challenge in retrofit installations where the shutters don't cover the entire window or are obstructed by window unit air conditioners or other appliances. So take those into consideration when designing or redesigning. And also, as a best practices approach, the shutters should be anchored to the wall surrounding the window rather than to the window or door frame itself. The shutter should never be anchored to the window frame unless A, the window is properly anchored to the wall in a way that resists wind pressures, and B, the shutter is certified to perform properly when attached to the window or the door frame. Shutters, screens, and panels require brackets or other mounting devices, such as anchors, to be secured to the walls or the other elements that surround the window, not to the window or the door itself. Motorized shutters are available, but if these are used, the shutter system should also be manually operable. If not, a loss of electrical power can render the shutters ineffective before the storm and might prevent reopening afterwards. When buying the windows, make sure the manufacturer and the supplier are trustworthy and that they can tell you if their product has passed the impact resistance and water infiltration testing. Proper installation methods, water intrusion testing, detailing of window perimeter, these are important. Sergio Sanz, a Miami-based principal hospitality designer at design firm HKS, recommends windows and doors that have the Miami-Dade County approval for high and low velocity impact. Go with the most stringent code requirements. You'll be glad you did when the storm has passed. A lot of these same rules about windows also apply to doors. Doors that swing outward give you an advantage compared to doors that swing inward because of where the weather stripping goes. With outswinging doors, the weather stripping is located on the inside where it's less susceptible to degradation than an exposed weather stripping on an inswinging door. Also, some interlocking weather stripping products are available for outswinging door assemblies that provide better performance than those used on doors that swing in. Window and door assemblies must be strong enough to withstand wind pressures acting on them, and again, they need to be fastened very securely to transfer the wind pressures to the adjacent wall. Pressures of doors or windows can allow glass to fracture or the frames or supports to fail, and anchorage failures can allow the entire door window units to be ripped from their walls. Those are all the big things, but small details in a storm can make a huge difference. Drainage, as we were talking about, can become a huge headache during a storm if debris gets in the way. I spoke with the Regional Director of Operations for Two Roads Hospitality, which operates the El San Juan Hotel in Puerto Rico. He told me that one of their upgrades to the 60-year-old hotel's drainage system was so that it could accommodate not just water surges, but also debris in the future. Railings can become projectiles during a storm. So make sure your railings are heavy and strong and really secured into their decks with very long screws that will hold them in place. Mr. Sands from HKS said that the product needs to have proper connection at all of its components, including the center members that make up the railing system, along with the post to slab connection. As an example, I was reading about the Sonesta Maho Beach Resort Casino and Spa. The Maho Group, the owners and operators of the Sonesta St. Martin resorts, had started rebuilding the Sonesta Maho Beach Resort in August following Hurricane Irma. The renovation included stripping the resort's Sky Tower building down to its main structural frame. The company used the work of TCK and LVKE Building Technology, a China-based green technology consortium that creates storm and fire-resistant building materials. The prefabricated TCK and LVKE composite panels that the company is using on the Sky Tower have an interior honeycomb reinforcement structure. These panels will be used for the building's exterior envelope and all interior partitions like the walls in the guest rooms, the public spaces, and the corridors. The team is also installing new windows and sliding doors with argon gas-filled air gaps. It's a good indication of what needs to be involved in making sure a building can stand up to a hurricane. The Maho Group tapped the Reggio Calabria's Building Future Lab, which tests advanced building performance, simulating earthquakes and hurricanes in a controlled setting. The tests at this lab were carried out on an exact replica of the Sky Tower's exterior facade, constructed with these panels, and over several days, a jet engine-like wind simulator created hurricane-like conditions, testing the material's resistance to both the winds and water penetration. They found that the panels held up to 200 mile per hour winds, and according to Wikipedia, which is never, ever wrong, Hurricane Irma's highest wind force was 180 miles per hour. So the testing, which abided by the American section of the International Association for Testing Materials, it's a sign of how important it is to be absolutely sure your building can stand up to the intense winds. Look for materials that have passed tests like these. The Sonesta Maho Beach Resort is scheduled to reopen in February, and wish them all the best. I'm eager to see it. Circling back to what the previous panelists have said about investing in improvements, building hotels that survive storms like these is not inexpensive, but governments can make it easier, and this is what we were calling for earlier. In Bermuda last year, the Tourism Investment Act went into effect, providing tax relief for hotel owners in the form of payroll tax as well as customs duty relief for a fixed period of time depending on the scale of the investment. The act applies not only to new hospitality development projects, but also for refurbished hotels. This offers a good incentive for hoteliers to upgrade their properties and make sure the buildings can withstand heavy winds and rains. And designing the hotel, this is part 5. The fifth tip is maintaining it. Designing the hotel to withstand a storm is only part of the process. Once the hotel's up and running, regular maintenance needs to be a priority. The hotel team needs to have and execute a hurricane action plan. After Hurricane Irene in Albany, New York, kind of far from the Caribbean, the Ramada Plaza filed an insurance claim for damage sustained during the storm, but the claim was rejected. Selective Insurance Company of America argued that the damage was not caused by the hurricane, but was caused because the hotel had not maintained its caulking, and that this had allowed the water through. The hotel sued for breach of contract. Selective sought dismissal of the lawsuit, and they won because they had an engineer who could prove the caulking had not been maintained. The court ruled for the insurance company and dismissed the case, which was obviously very bad news for the hotel. So, in summary, there are 3 things in life you never, ever want to be cheap about: shoes, rum, and building a hotel that can stand up to a hurricane. The storms that used to hit every century are now hitting several times a year. Hotels do not have the luxury of assuming that this season won't be that bad. In 2015, Hurricane Patricia reached sustained wind speeds of 215 miles per hour, beyond even what the St. Martin Resort is preparing for. Hopefully we will not see wind speeds like this again for a very long time, but it isn't impossible. So in designing or redesigning your hotel, you have to start thinking in terms of 200 mile per hour winds, and think about what you can do to protect your property and your investment from that kind of storm, and adjust your budget accordingly, because however much it costs to build a property that can stand up to a storm, it costs a lot more to repair it every year. The key word I've been hearing since I arrived here yesterday is resilience. I heard it from Mr. Riley, from His Excellency the Prime Minister, from Tom. Everyone is talking about resilience, and that needs to be the focus. It's not just the resilience of the Caribbean coming together to support one another after the storms. It's the resilience of the designers and of the governments willing to work with developers and investors to build hotels that can keep the tourists coming back days after the storm has passed. Thank you very much.
I think we've taken great comfort that the government have a system now, but we've confused that with continuing to build in flood-prone areas. We have not stopped that. I went to Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria last year, and spent quite a bit of time on the ground. And if you look at Harvey, the United States' 4th largest city, Houston, it was built in a flood zone. And the Texans, they think they can do anything. And they put a series, if you've ever been there, freeways over the flood zone. The water wanted to go from North Texas to the Houston coast. They run all of the freeways, and they took away all the bayous and natural wetlands and drained them and put subdivisions. So I still think we're stuck on stupid because we try to defy Mother Nature. Mother Nature is, over the centuries and hundreds of years, developed our land for the water to flow, and we have tried to defy that. If you build next to a river, you're going to flood. If you build in a valley, you're going to flood. If you don't control the water that is used in your consumption, in the way we live, and you don't clean it, and you think Mother Nature is going to take care of it, you're going to get red tide. You're going to get dead fish. You're going to have green ponds. So water in terms of defending against it, we have not made the progress that we've made on putting secondary phones in and having a news conference and telling people what's going on and doing risk communication. We do that well. Storm is coming, evacuate. And then the next month, we approve a subdivision inside a flood zone. That same politician. So I do think we're stuck on stupid, but I think it's our human nature. Because studying history, it's just the way we are as people, but we have to change that because we see the devastating impact when we get a significant event like Maria hit Puerto Rico. That was a wake-up call. Think about what that happened, it hit Miami. Think about what would have happened if it hit Miami. It would pale in comparison what it did to Puerto Rico. Pale in comparison. You got 5 million people south of Fort Lauderdale with 2 roads to get out. It pales in comparison. On the other hand, it shows that besides flooding, sir, and water, the loss of power, electricity. We continue to think about electricity the way we did the last century. We need to think renewable. We need to take our wastewater that flush out of the toilet and turn it into energy. There's no reason island nation like this should be recycling 98% of your garbage, because that garbage become energy. We need to think renewable, we need to think sustainable, but how do we break that paradigm? I think we need to start having dialogues with industry as well as government, because if we don't start using renewable energy, if we don't start, every plastic bottle on this island should be coated to become something else in its next life, as opposed to being thrown away. The idea is, and you can see it already starting. Yesterday, my wife ordered a drink, and it came without a straw. When she asked for the straw, they brought a paper straw. So we're making those easy moves. How do we make the big moves in doing design, redesigning for a sustainable going into the next century? The problem is none of the CEOs want to do it on their watch because they want to look brilliant, they want to make more profit at less money, okay? And the idea is to reduce costs and increase profit without investing in the infrastructure that's going to take us into the rest of this century. And I think that's the dilemma. But yeah, we are stuck on stupid.
Do you, another quick question. Do you think we have mitigated, I mean, you talk a lot about flood. Do you think we mitigated the wind issue? Do you think we built to withstand, or we've solved the 180 mile an hour breeze?
Wind is a lot easier to deal with. It's not the wind in the institutional buildings like this. Yeah. It's the wind in buildings that were built the last century that started out as cottages. Okay? If you look at particularly Florida Peninsula, which I think is a part of the Caribbean, they built a lot of homes there for winter use, and they turned into permanent homes. And they use mobile homes, what we call in the States mobile home. Economical, but very subject to 60, 80, 90 mile an hour winds. And when you look at the Caribbean, a lot of the homes were built for air moving through, not for the storm. The idea is that we'll rebuild. But I think we could do that better. I think we will be judged, and whether people are going to hurry back to the tourist area is during a disaster how we take care of the vulnerable population. If we can host an event like this with thousands of visitors, tomorrow there's a hurricane and your people are standing outside not having food and water, I think we got to have a plan for that. Because when they have food and water, you're going to rebuild your tourism industry quicker. But if the whole focus is on keeping people alive as opposed to being able to do that internally, I think each government needs to do that internally with having food and water stored and ready to take care of your own people, and then you can rebuild back quicker.
So you make an interesting point, and I'm going to go to a question here that, he made the point of Miami, Florida. That's not us, but that's where most of our foreign visitors originate. They come through Miami. That's where most of us, especially in the Bahamas, we get all our food and supplies. So when Miami gets hit, it really affects business here as well. We just can't get people in, can't get people out, we can't get food in, we can't get food out, building supplies. It has a domino effect down the islands. So question, right at the back. Yeah, come up to the front mic. Come up to the front mic. We let you in the...
I love that stuck on stupid. Yeah. Many hoteliers, I'm the owner of a small hotel, and there's quite a few of us here. I like to say that we're on the beach. So I say that life's a beach if you want to live on a beach. So I like that stuck on stupid. So I don't consider myself stupid, but I know that I'm going to have a beach of a time. Now, I have two questions for Tom. One is, those of us that live on a beach and small hoteliers, we really can't afford a lot of the things that you were showing us. What we can do is take our pickup truck in the bush and pick up some rock and try to lay it down and hope for the best. But I have two questions. One question is do you think if you're trying to protect a building, say on a beach, are gabions, where the water kind of goes through and the plants can grow on, better than a firm structure? And I'm talking about on a beach that doesn't have granite rock, like it's not volcanic, it's limestone, it's got some movement underneath. Are gabions better than like concrete walls? That's the first question. The second question is do you have any resource for how to do grunions? We all want to do it, and we do it, and we usually screw it up because there's movement of the sand as the seasons change. One in the winter it moves this way, in the summer it moves that way. So we put out a grunion, and then all of a sudden we have no beach here, and that's over there, and we didn't want it over there. Is there any resource for those of us that aren't big like that can hire your firm for grunions and that sort of thing to try to protect our beaches a little bit? So those two questions.
Well, the first one is the gabions, and thinking of the green infrastructure, using gabions is a better system because it's a bit forgiving, right? It's got that flexibility, a concrete wall that goes across. You said, some of these things are expensive. Well, they're not really expensive, right? I want to get that point across that a lot of these systems are actually cheaper than the conventional piping of water and bringing water through. You can, promote that water system naturally, and it can be, like you're saying, you get a pickup truck full of rocks and you bring those in, and you can create that bioswale. It doesn't necessarily have to be vegetated. It could be rockery, or it could be a combination of both. So the cost, you really got to look at that, and we found that it's actually cheaper to do some of these systems naturally. It's cheaper than the conventional.
Do you know of any resource for a small guy like
yeah,
that
so
has a 20-room
we
hotel?
do a lot of projects, and I showed big projects and I showed small projects. We do a lot of smaller projects, and the work we do, it's not all us, obviously. If we're doing these projects, we need engineering, we need other services, we need biologists, we need all of that. And for you, there are shoreline consultants that we use that would be able to give you, it's not going to cost you thousands and thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars. You just need to do it right. You need to be able to get a coastal engineer to give you how you create that shoreline restoration for you.
Okay, I'm going to be contacting.
And I can give you a guy that's actually Canadian that does this.
Next.
Right.
Next.
My name is Martin Copeland. I'm an aviation and tourism consultant, and I have a question for Tom and Jena. It's not a structural question about how you prepare for the next series of possible hurricanes. It's more a strategic question, because I've noticed in some of the Caribbean islands that A lot of them would like to see big hotels, brand hotels, bring in a lot of tourism and so on. But just observing a few islands, St. Martin and St. Bart's. St. Bart's has about 2,400 villa rooms. By December, they had 50% of those rooms were available. So they're small buildings, they're small structures. St. Martin has a lot of major hotels. The Maho has something like 300 rooms. It's coming back in February. The Westin Hotel has 250 rooms. It's not coming back for several years. The Great Bay Hotel has 300 rooms. It's gone for some time. So those are big structures. They received major damage. Now, strategically, should governments of the Caribbean islands looking at a more diverse, sort of smaller property, villa-type facility in order to recover faster than waiting for 2 years or a year for large hotels to be reconstructed?
What we saw after Katrina, and just to give you an example, is that we ended up with more hotels after the storm than we had before the storm. But that was due to government intervention in providing low-interest rebuilding funds. And that's normally the hang-up in bringing those businesses back online. So I think you need a joint venture between business and the industry to have funds available, because the insurance don't cover it all. I mean, you get into all the drama arguing with the insurance, whether it was wind or rain, and whether it was in your policy. But I think when you get some government help, because in New Orleans it's 20% of the economy, the tourism. And it was big enough, and it's 20% of the state economy in the state of Louisiana. So by the government providing that funds for reconstruction, and that gave people time enough to argue about the claim later. But we ended up with more hotels and more restaurants because the government was able to provide low-interest loans to operators, because without that industry, we lost 20% of our income in the state of Louisiana. So I think that is a consideration. As far as the buildings, it's building dependent. Some of these buildings were in need of renovation. They were built, if you look at New Orleans after World War II, for an expanded tourism industry, and they had exceeded their life expectancy. So did the sewer system. That hadn't been replaced. So, because if that's not working, you don't have clean water, you don't have safe removal of the sewer water in heavy rains. So it's the overall investment in the infrastructure, and that these events bring all this together at one time, right? And all the politicians, well, it's a storm did it. No, it didn't. That stuff was worn out. It should have been replaced 10 years ago, and nobody wanted to pay for it. But I think that is the ongoing issue, sir. And what the storms do, they highlight a system. It's kind of like the Puerto Rico electrical system. Broke before it happened, but it brings together how can we do it better now, as opposed to redoing it like we did it later. After World War II, the Germans buried their electricity. Boop, done with it. No problem with wind. We need to start thinking that way, in the way Tom and his team can help redesign that and take it from an emotional state to a economic and structural state.
Minister.
Yes, I agree that any government that it relies on tourism, that wants tourism, needs to invest in it. They need to work with the hoteliers, with the investors, to make sure any improvements are financially possible. They will reap the rewards. We've already talked about how much more money you get in. It's a spectacular return on investment. And any government that wants those tourism dollars needs to put out the money in the first place to make sure it's feasible.
And I have just a small point about that too. You know, you were talking about should we develop the bigger hotels or just villas and smaller things. To me, I think the market is in a demand, and you mentioned that you were part of that demand, and what the market demands is what we should be building. I don't want to change what we want to build. It's just how do we build it better? How do we do it so it can, be able to withstand these storms. So changing that market, I don't think is what we want to do, but how do we just enhance it and get a resilient development?
Okay, one more question from the, sorry, there's a line behind you, so I'm going to work through the line. The Minister of Tourism for Barbados.
Thank you, Minister. I want to thank the panel. I think the presentations were excellent. This issue, not only for Barbados, but I think I can speak for the whole region, is not just a developmental challenge, but when you think about the extent to which we rely on tourism, especially the smaller economies, it is an existential threat if we don't get this right. The fate of entire populations rely on our ability to get this right. And it is for that reason that I am thinking that we can't rely only on fortune or serendipity. We have to be able to make a decisive intervention. And I concede that I think legalistically, perhaps that is because that was my profession before I came this way into public life. I'm asking myself how many countries have town and country planning regulations that, or building codes that require the type of resilient construction that we're talking about. If we don't have that legislative framework, I suspect we're going to find ourselves in a situation where a few may do the resilient type of building, and then several others may not. That doesn't go very far to solving the problem, because the totality of the country stands to be compromised if this is not done across the board. But because I have been in law for a long time, I also recognize that there is another challenge. We don't really have the quantity of legislative drafters in the Caribbean to take the best of building codes to be found perhaps in the United States or other places, and model them to suit, or remodel and refashion them to suit the specifics of the Bahamas and Barbados and St. Lucia, because there are going to be some variations on the theme, and then get them to where the politician can pass it through Parliament. And it seems to me, therefore, that a useful project might be for the CTO and the CHTA to pool such resources as you have, and if need be, yes, to come knocking on doors in government. Certainly, as a minister in Barbados, I would be willing to find, or to persuade my finance minister to find some contribution. But I think we have on a regional basis to try to have some sort of a consultancy done, which will allow us to devise a model piece of legislation, so that we build in accordance with that basic level of framework, the resilience building to which you spoke so extensively, and quite frankly, which we're doing none of in Barbados. The permeable paving, the green roof, green. I made a list of them on my phone, and I'm going to chat with my PS when we get back to Barbados. We are not doing this, but it is perfectly clear to me that those steps, and steps to mitigate against storm surge and so on, those are realities we can't escape from. We have most of our hotels already constructed along the coast, so that I hear the idea of building inland, and perhaps that too can come. But what are we going to do about the millions and millions of dollars invested along the coast? So that to the extent that you can refurbish, and certainly for greenfield, vertical build-outs where you're going to start fresh, you have to have a threshold, I think, that takes into consideration a basic level of resilience, and to have that uniform, not only for my country, but I suspect everyone else as well, so that, we don't all be spending a lot of money trying to reinvent the wheel. And that's the suggestion I was going to make.
Thank you, Minister. Excellent intervention. Yeah, we're getting the evil eye from Santana over here. And there's another question coming. Just very, very quickly to say, though, but the minister is absolutely right. I mean, the temptation when something like this happens is because tourism is the engine that's driving the economy and you want to get people working again, the temptation is to just get the thing open as fast as you can, build something as fast as you can, but then the next hurricane comes and knocks it all down. But we've made a note, though, to make sure that SEDEMA, which is our FEMA, which is, well, sort of, which is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, is in fact addressing those kinds of issues. They are, but we want to be sure, to the minister's point, that that kind of best practice gets circulated so that we do in fact build better. So the point is very well taken, sir. That's something that we've taken under advice.
And you're absolutely right. The implementation is critical, and I did mention that. And how do we do that? I'm not sure. Can we do it Caribbean-wide? Is there an association that's Caribbean-wide that we can implement some of those systems, right?
Of course.
Or is it island by island? You're right. What are the resources to be able to do that? We need to be able to draft these systems and put them in place as regulations. And it's not the Caribbean isn't the only place where this is lacking. It's everywhere in the world. There's not these regulations everywhere and anywhere. It's very, very rare that you find them. But we need to look at these things. It's obvious in the Caribbean. It's critical that we do this. So how can we work together? We can help you to prepare these guidelines. We do it on large projects and smaller projects, but we do prepare the guidelines for developers in different countries because they don't have those guidelines in the countries that we're working in. So we could do that here, but work with you, whether that's Caribbean-wide, which would be a great way of looking at it. It could be island by island as well. But there could be an overall one that talks about the Caribbean. And it's just, it doesn't need to be a lot. And you don't want to make it restrictive either. We don't want to stop development in the countries or in the islands. We want to be able to promote that development, but just steer it in that right direction. So we've got to be able to do it in a practical way.
Last question.
Hi, thank you. Bob Curley from Jack's Facts magazine. So Tom, the one thing I noticed about the site plan for Hainan was that it required the hotel buildings to be set back significantly from the beach. So I'm wondering whether that's generally the case when you're looking at beachfront property, and how do you convince A, hoteliers that they should put the buildings back from the beach, and B, how do you convince travelers, more importantly, that it's okay to have a beach resort that's not actually on the beach?
It's a good question, right? And it really is site-specific, right? We have to, again, we do that analysis and we look at the site and we look at where we can locate the buildings, and the elevation of the buildings is critical. These days, you always want to make sure the finished floor is about 4 meters above sea level. That's very high, but that's what we need to accommodate now. And how does that work with the tourism? Well, you're getting a different vantage point. Now you're viewing the sea from above and you're seeing that shoreline. You get the terracing down, so it's that transition from above down to the waterfront. Do you have to set it back? Most cases, yes, for this system to work. But there's other ways of making it an attractive and a unique experience for the guests, even though you're not sitting, 5 feet above sea level and you're sitting on the beach. We still want to have that feeling of the beach, and it's just a different way of looking at it. And it becomes unique to the guests, so you still want to promote that experience, but it is a different way of looking at it and a different way of designing the buildings and the hotel.
Final comment by the
My
gentleman.
final comment is this. The only one going to save us is us. When you look at the impact of climate change, don't wait for Beijing, Washington, or London to solve this. Because climate change to you is a function of survival. You're surrounded by water. There are some dates where many of the islands in the Caribbean are going to be covered and no longer inhabitable. I think you're on the forefront of an opportunity. In China, the word difficulty, the opposite word, or challenge or disaster is opportunity. You can develop the intellectual capital in the Caribbean, not for tourism, but for survival. This is about your survival. And we need to bring the best minds from all those great capitals, bring them here, and put them in the university, and let's start doing it. And don't wait, because it's not a function of how many tourism, it's how you're going to live here in 50 years with rising sea levels. And this can be the place where we can attract the best minds, because this is the place the work needs to be done first. Look, the rest of these people that talk about rising sea levels, only a part of their coastline is touched by the water. You're surrounded by water. This is about survival. And if we're going to see something happen, in 6 months from now, there need to be a damn conference here about survival. And that's, I think, we need to do.
Very profound note. I'd like to thank my panel. Hugh Riley, Secretary General of the CTO. I'll just call him the General. Tom Hook and Jena Tesse Fox. I think it was a wonderful panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.